I'm John Stewart, Chair of Emory University of Department of Philosophy, and on behalf of my department and the university, I'm pleased to welcome you all, especially members of the National Floor and Safety Institute. Every night there are all kinds of lectures, conferences, and performances on our campus, and tonight there's final exams to study for and in our city. And so I'm very pleased that you chose to be here this evening. I admire your judgment. You're probably thinking, trying to count how many addresses you have attended that are co-sponsored by an academic department of philosophy and the Professional National Floor and Safety Institute. The answer before tonight is probably 0. I think this is a first, due in large part to the efforts of my colleague Mark Fagiano. But let me just point out very, very quickly that this is not such an odd couple of sponsors as it might seem. One of my department's main areas of strength is pragmatic philosophy, American pragmatism, a philosophy that locates the value of theories in their practical consequences, and a philosophy driven by questions about how to live, not just think, but live ethically and intelligently. And so in this light, concrete issues about consumer protection, about moving automobiles to the people moving on floors, social well-being, environmental justice and sustainability, and democracy as a way of life take on both philosophical and immediately practical importance. The event tonight seeks to capture and link both of these kinds of importance. The best public welcomes are heartfelt and very brief. Keeping this in mind, to introduce Mr. Nader, let me call to the podium Mr. Russ Kendzior, founder and chairman of the board of the National Floor Safety Institute. Mr. Kendzior, an internationally recognized safety expert and leader, is president of Traction Experts Incorporated, a member of several prestigious councils and boards, and author of the book Slip and Fall Prevention Made Easy. Russ Kendzior.
Thank you, and thanks again for your participation tonight. What would the country be like without Ralph Nader? Would all the people whose lives he saved by implementing mandatory seatbelt usage be around today? Would our grandchildren be breathing in clean air or carcinogens? Would renewable energy be the newest catchphrase or accountable campaign promise? Fortunately, we don't have to worry about that anymore, other than to imagine the unimaginable. Thanks to Ralph Nader, Nader's America's foremost public citizen has changed the face of our country in big business, often dragging big business, kicking and screaming into the future. And as history has proven, ultimately, to their benefit, things don't always work out the way you think. Like bad-tasting medicine, Nader has sometimes had to force his remedies on corporate America for their own good and ours. For instance, Ralph actually managed to save General Motors, despite itself, by passing legislation which forced the auto industry to ignore the short-term costs and include seatbelts as standard materials in automobiles. By achieving this, not only did Nader help to save countless lives, he also helped save General Motors from certain lawsuit death, a story famously chronicled in his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Honored by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century, Ralph Nader continues to fight the good fight in government and in public opinion. Nader helped create the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, of which we had the previous Assistant Secretary of Labor as one of our speakers at this very podium just hours ago. He also helped found the Consumer Product Safety Commission, to which members of that organization are currently in the audience. Due to his zeal, we now have safer drinking water, cleaner air, and freedom of information. His citizen groups, such as the public interest research groups, flourish on college campuses and the national stage, striving to protect the public and advance social justice. Many of Ralph Nader's most significant triumphs include consumer rights, open government, and more humane business practices are fully integrated into each of our lives. Among his victories are the ideas and commodities we now take for granted: seatbelts, airbags, crash-worthy cars, better labeling on food, lower levels of lead in our drinking water, smoking awareness, and healthy eating habits. His latest works, Unstoppable, the emerging left-right alliance to dismantle the corporate state, and Told You So, the big book on weekly columns, provide an overview of the solutions to the many problems confronting our society, citing examples from his books in which he deconstructs complex problems and illustrates solutions in a very simple and effective language. In Mr. Nader's presentations, he speaks from the heart with unmatched insider experience, confidence, and candor. His speaking style has remained the same as his approach to all things in life: honest, informed, and intimate. Listeners always feel comfortable voicing their concerns and raising questions on the difficult issues this country and their community are facing today and heading into the future. His warnings of yesterday are the realities of today. And now, as a speaker, he still continues to fight on all of our behalf, sustaining our country's safe practices, exposing the unethical, and making sure that no matter what the issue, APB audiences are always the first to know. On a personal note, I came to know Ralph Nader by way of my daughter, Annie, who was a U.S. Naval Academy midshipman. And she was flying home from Annapolis, and while she was at the airport, she saw a gentleman signing books. And she went up to him and didn't know who he was, and he introduced himself, Ralph Nader. And she said, "Oh my God, my dad has all your books. He's talked about you, forever." And of course, that impressed him. She bought his book, autographed to me, and he and I created a bit of a dialogue just shortly thereafter, whereby I exchanged a copy of my book. Years went by, didn't really hear from him. Got a very nice typewritten letter, and then got a call one day asking if I would be able to do an interview in his radio show on this subject of elder fall prevention, slip and fall prevention, which I did. And from there, Ralph Nader and myself found ourselves in a kinship. His battle against the automobile industry is our battle against a very different industry, the industry that prevents those who want to prevent slips, trips, and falls from getting that information, from learning about prevention techniques. And so I share a kinship, separated almost exactly by 50 years. Unsafe at Any Speed was published in 1965, and here we are in 2015. 50 years have gone by, but the battle hasn't stopped. Help me welcome tonight's guest speaker, Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Russell, for that introduction, and thank you for being here. The size of this audience reminds me of the old days in the early auto safety battles. When, if you talked about the driver, there was still the auditorium. If you talked about the vehicle, not so much. If you talked about the highway design, even less. So I'd like to, the first part of my comments, I'd like to talk about sort of the pattern that we discovered in the process of advocating for consumer health and safety. Were you able to hear me before that? Okay. Now it's better. It all started with me when I began losing a lot of friends to severe traffic crashes, either totally disabled or they lost their lives. In those days, it was a much more frequent occurrence. For example, the death rate per 100 million vehicle miles in 1965 was 5.6 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles. It's now 1.1. So it's a dramatic decline. Even absolutely, there are fewer fatalities today, relatively far fewer, given the massive expansion of miles traveled and motor vehicles registered. The second thing was I started hitchhiking a lot to college, law school, and I would be picked up by truckers, and they'd often reach the scene of the crash before the ambulance or the police. And it was pretty grisly. And fire and screams and silence and groans. And I began to see certain things in the way the vehicle crumbled. And one of the most prominent ones was the rearward displacement of the steering column would go up. Of course, you can't survive that. Into the driver and then up. So I went to law school. I wrote a paper on unsafe automobile design. This isn't quality control. The design was unsafe. Didn't have airbags, didn't have seatbelts, didn't have padded dash panels, didn't have stronger door latches, didn't have rollover protection, didn't have side protection, didn't have head restraints, didn't have stability enhancements. And in doing the paper, I discovered a lot of gaps. One gap was there was virtually no engineering school working on it. How come? This is the biggest operating engineering system in the country. It was the fourth leading cause of death in the country, the first leading cause for youngsters aged 4 to 24. MIT, Caltech, Rensselaer, nothing. There was no degree in automotive engineering. It was mechanical, civil, and then I realized why. It's because their employers, the auto industry, wanted them to graduate in a general engineering course, and as a GM journal once put it, we'll teach them the industry way. And what was the industry way? To starve their safety budgets, to give them virtually no testing facilities, and to subordinate engineering integrity to stylish pornography. That's the way they taught them the way. The stylist was king. The horsepower enhancer was king, but the safety engineers were few and far between. It even got worse in the sense that they actually peddled this theory that if you had a seatbelt and you suddenly were in a crash, your organs inside would rip out. So why have a seatbelt? Because you just be more injured. I rebutted that by giving them data from the Swedes who had three-point belts a long time before they came in US, Volvo. And I challenged them to differentiate between the anatomy of a Swedish person and an anatomy of an American under equal G-load levels of deceleration. It's hard to believe how ignorant they were deliberately, and how their poor safety engineers would go to these safety conferences and have to peddle this kind of junk. But they did until the mid-60s. The third thing that happened was I got in touch with a few engineers on the QT. One was a retired engineer, others were frustrated whistleblowers who didn't want to lose their jobs. And I learned that the Pentagon was the main funder of crash worthiness research and development, because they realized they were losing more airmen on the highway than they were in Korea at that time. So they funded human factors research, crash worthiness research, Cornell Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health, and a couple other universities. And the reports were like gold to me. They were priceless, authoritative, and opened people's eyes. To give you an example, I was testifying for the Senate Commerce Committee, and Senator Warren Magnuson was the chair from the state of Washington, and there was a physician ahead of me who was testifying, and he said, 2 Chevrolets happened to completely collide symmetrically, like that, in New Jersey, and one walked away alive and the other was killed. The difference was the seatbelt. And the doctor said, you know, maybe the seatbelt couldn't have stopped the crash, the first collision, but the seatbelt stopped the second collision of the people going into the dash panel, into the steering column. So And so Magnuson, it was like a light bulb went out, because until then, all the blame was on the nut behind the wheel. And then what the doctor and what we did was we divided the fatality into two collisions. The car being stopped by a tree or an abutment or whatever, and the motorist being stopped by the car. And the dash panel was like a room full of knives, some of you remember. You could split your skull in a 10-mile-an-hour collision. So that led to the following assertion that I would say before Congress. I would say, you're blaming the driver. Driver gets drunk, driver gets reckless. All this is true. But you know what doesn't get drunk? The seatbelt. You know what doesn't get reckless? The collapsible steering column. So where do you want to put your emphasis? You want to put your emphasis on adapting the engineering environment to the frailties of the driver. Doesn't mean you ignore it. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, others done a good job. But the variables are much easier to control. You have all kinds of human variables. Someone gets up in the morning, they've lost their job, they're very morose, they take a couple swigs, they hit the road. You know, padded dash panel, not going to take a couple swigs. This stuff is so simple. It was known by the Roman chariot manufacturers in ancient Rome. You know, they had padding. They had seatbelts in World War I airplanes to keep the pilots from falling out of the plane when they did this. But the auto companies were mired in technological stagnation, and they spread it everywhere their influence could move. There was no state standards, there was no federal standards, and where there was once in a while a brake fluid standard, they took it from the Society of Automotive Engineers, which was an appendage of the auto companies on company missions. So here we had a situation where everybody had a story of someone being in a crash, some being injured, some being killed. But the mindset, the brainwash was, it's the nut behind the wheel. In fact, the auto companies would say, the car doesn't have a mind of its own. The car doesn't move. It's animated by the driver. And if it's animated in the wrong way, it's the driver's fault. All this was turned around in a matter of 2 years. Phil Donahue show, Merv Griffin show, Mike Douglas show. Those were the days when you had entertainment shows that reserved about 20% of their time to serious business. They were afraid of the Federal Communications Act of 1934, that the public airways belonged to the people, and they had to adhere to some measure of the public interest, necessity, and convenience. And then there was the fairness doctrine, which George Herbert Walker Bush got rid of. And then Rush Limbaugh took over and intimidated the Congress that wanted to reinstate it. But it happened very quickly. And then what happened was the brown envelopes started coming in. Whistleblowers from the industry. St. Louis, assembly line, Chevrolet. Engineer tells me they've got a problem with the throttle sticking. And that's an uncomfortable thing when you're on the highway. Led to 6.7 million motor vehicles being recalled, right at the height of the motor vehicles legislation in Congress. It was very appropriate to get the attention of Congress. What were our tools when the two laws passed in 1966? The motor vehicle and the highway safety laws, same time. One, the Auto Safety Agency had to enforce the law. So had to issue mandatory standards. No more voluntary standards, at least not under the auto safety law. Product Safety Commission had a different kind of history in the drafting of the legislation. Now what happened was we put in the highway safety law a provision that gave NHTSA which is the National Highway Safety Agency, an independent research and development capability. Why? Because if it didn't have that, the auto companies would all get together and they would say to any proposal to establish a mandatory standard for brakes, tires, crash protection, oh, it's not feasible. It's technologically not feasible, horrendously expensive, we can't meet the standard. And so we wanted NHTSA to be able to say, oh yes you can, because here's our R&D. That helped develop the Research Safety Vehicle Program, which is about 30 cars that were built, some on contract, Cornell Aero Lab, etc. And they were designed for mass production, 2,500 pounds. Just think of this. This is in the early 70s. 2,500 pounds, 50-mile-an-hour protection in a fixed barrier collision, 45-mile-an-hour protection side barrier, side door collision, and 32 miles per gallon. We're not even there yet. Just imagine. So when these cars were built, what car company could say, we can't do it? Oh yes you can, here it is, here are the blueprints, here's who did it, they don't even have as much experience as you, here's the cost factor. So the auto companies decided to go to the White House and go to the Congress with their buddy John Dingell to put the pressure on NHTSA. And we would put the pressure on the other side, and they slowed down the process. But enough got through so that over 1 million lives have been saved, tens of millions of injuries prevented or diminished in severity, and a great effect on foreign cars, which had to meet US standards, so they began upgrading. I must say that the Swedish cars, Saab and Volvo, were ahead of us in seatbelts, way ahead of us in seatbelts and in rollover protection. If you ever want to roll over in a 1975 Saab. But in other areas, we were the first in the world, and we were a big market. The other technique we used was a lawsuit. When the auto company stopped NHTSA from issuing the airbag standard, we encouraged State Farm, interesting, loss prevention, State Farm insurance. They filed the suit because they could pay for the lawyers, and they got a 9-0 decision. 9-0 in the Supreme Court, ordering NHTSA to issue the safety standard because they thought their non-issuing was arbitrary, capricious, and violated the 1966 Act. So we did use the courts to buttress the regulatory agencies. The media was a great help in the mid-60s. They got on the auto safety beat. They loved to report recalls. The main media that helped us was the New York Times, Detroit News, Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal, and UPI and AP. And if you ever want to get anything done in safety, you've got to work hard to get a reporter here or an editor there who will carry your disclosures and your condemnations and your case studies, etc., like a lot of what is in Russell's book. What other tools did we use? Calls to the White House. We knew some people in the White House to head off trouble. Calls to some appropriations committees. The way they crippled NHTSA was to starve it. And one of the reasons why NHTSA was not on top of the Toyota sudden acceleration and the key problem with GM and Honda, etc., was they didn't have the engineers. They didn't have enough people, much less engineers versed in electronics and motor vehicles. The ignition switch, that was an easy one. But there are others that are much more complex, and the auto companies know how to play the lobbying game, the withholding information game. They hire their own specialists, and so on. However, a great tool, which is emerging now even better than ever, are product liability lawsuits. And if you think that NHTSA generated its own concern, being pummeled by the White House, pummeled by the Congress, starved over the years, to wake up to Toyota, Honda, GM, all the headlines you've been reading about, they started with plaintiff, product liability lawyer, subpoena, depositions, disgorging the material, getting into the press, and then getting backbone to NHTSA and pushing back on the congressional auto industry partisan. So product liability cases are very important in that respect. The standards groups, very disappointing. The ASAE, the ASME, the Society of Mechanical Engineers, the ISO standards, the SAE standards. Here's the problem. They are overwhelmingly dominated by their particular industries. Everybody knows that. But more specifically, the industries know that these standards, if they are up to date and reasonably strong, can be used against them. They can be transformed into regulations, and they can be transformed into effective litigation. Because they say, look, here is the standard, you violated the standard, you're negligent, you're going to pay. But what happens if the standards are weak? They can be used to support the industry position. Oh, we met the SAE standard. Why are you holding us to a higher standard? What's your authority? So they work overtime, and as you know, there are thousands of committees internationally, domestically. Most engineering students are taught nothing about their professional societies who set weak standards that are industry dominated that have to be picked up by the regulators because there are no other standards, because the regulators don't have the budget to do their own testing. And that's true in more than just hardware. It's true in drugs, it's true in cosmetics, flammable fabrics, pipelines, so on. So this has been a real problem. Here's how the traditional standards worked in our area. Number one, just think how anti-intellectual and anti-engineering it is. Number one, the committees were overwhelmingly representative of the companies. They didn't have many consumer or worker or even academic, independent academics. They had indentured academics. And besides, who could afford to go to these meetings? What consumer group can afford to go to these meetings? Maybe Consumers Union could. But most of the others, they couldn't. Some of them were far away, traveled. But they never really had adequate representation. Secrecy of the process. No dissent was published. Just think, no technical dissent. The rationale for the standard was not revealed. It just was issued as a standard. What kind of analysis is it? What kind of cross-examination? And the consensus principle brought it down to the lowest common denominator. So if Chrysler objected, it would carry the day on an SAE standard, even if GM and Ford would go along with it. There was a consensus principle to keep any kind of controversy down and to make sure that no one leaped forward and embarrassed the rest. And that's basically what the ISO is all about as well. They have a little bit more representation, but by and large, the profession of engineering in this area has been captured by the employed engineer's employer. There was once a dean at Harvard Law School, where I went to law school, and he wrote an article once and he defined the profession. What's the difference between a profession and a trade? What's the difference between an engineer and a plumber? And he says three things. One, a learned tradition. The second is independence. Profession cannot be controlled by a commercial entity and still be a profession. And the third is a tradition of public service. For example, lawyers are supposed to, because they're a profession, they're supposed to represent poor people if the judge asks them to do so for nothing. And so the difference between a plumber sees pipe, you know, uses the pipe. He's not supposed to be concerned about standards, about professional ethics, about selling the pipe. He's supposed to apply the pipe. He may know a lot more about the pipe than the engineer, but he's at the end of the stream, where professions are supposed to keep up with the research, expand the research, be independent, so they bring their conscience to work every day, and they have a set of professional ethics and a tradition of public service. They're asked to testify in court or before a legislature. They're not supposed to be handcuffed by their corporate employers and still be a member of a profession. Engineering professions didn't meet those standards. They were an employed or an indentured profession, and still are. And the engineering curriculum does not really open engineering students to all those obligations in response to all the rewards that a profession merits. So the struggle goes on. The auto safety program was very successful by comparison, but it could have been much more successful. In some ways, the competition is kicking in now, where they would never compete over safety. They're now beginning to say, hey, we have side airbags. We have, you know, better braking systems. So it's healthy that way. They're beginning to compete when they would never compete. In fact, we got the Justice Department to prosecute the auto companies for working through the Automobile Manufacturers Association in the early 70s, the prosecution, to agree not to come independently and say to the government, we can meet this pollution standard. We can meet this emission standard. So they agreed to have one front, one position, and that was a violation of the antitrust laws. They agreed not to compete, and that was a violation. And they settled. And they settled for monitoring for 25, 30 years, and they were basically warned the next prosecution is going to be jail, serious stuff. So the interesting thing here is, surprised me, is they now are competing globally on some various safety features. The stability one was a competition factor. More and more cars now come in with that. And in some ways, they were ahead of the standard. The standards process was politically slowed down to a point where the auto companies would brag that they exceed federal standards. Boy, I love to hear that one. That was bad news, because it wasn't that there was such great exceeding, it was that the freezing of the federal standards. Like the tire companies would say, our tires far exceed federal tire standards. Why not? The tire standards were not upgraded for 32 years. It was only when the Ford Explorer and the Firestone scandal occurred. So they were frozen. Now look at the comparisons with what brings you here today. And I hope this is just the first of many such conferences, just the way we had the first John Paul Stapp conference on automotive safety, focusing on the automobile. John Paul Stapp was an Air Force colonel and MD who basically saw all the service men and women killed in crashes, and he decided to prove that restraints in automobiles would not rip out your innards. He put himself on a sled, 90 miles an hour, slowed down, G-force levels. He actually damaged his retina once. Very courageous doctor. And so they named it after him. And you went to those conferences. They started in the late 60s. And it was all on the motor vehicle. Plenty of conferences on the driver. It was on the motor vehicle adapting to driver and highways. The highway design racket is the same thing. Do you know, for example, the asphalt and concrete industry, they have been blocking superior highway materials for years. For example, there were actually 3-4 miles here and 3-4 miles there up in Pennsylvania where a DuPont engineer, retired, developed highway materials. And they were almost impossible to have potholes because they were like yay high with a polyurethane strip in the middle, and they breathed in the winter and summer. But of course they used less asphalt, right? They used less concrete. Hundreds of billions of dollars because the engineering profession couldn't break loose in the highway area and challenge the highway lobby, which controlled the Federal Highway Administration in terms of the standard. And this is the hardest thing I've ever tried to get the press to focus on. We have the worst highway materials of any Western country. There are interstate highways that start breaking up in a few years, like one in Florida. It's a racket. So the interesting thing about this whole standard situation is the government often sends emissaries to these standards groups. You've probably met them. But they're really in a subordinate role. They're sort of spotters. They're not given the gravity of their mission statutorily that they deserve when they sit on these committees. It's a control technology process. And I hope that the courts are not padlocked so people can continue bringing product liability cases. All right, now, there isn't anybody I've ever met who hasn't had a friend and relative fall. Is anybody here ever? Okay. It's life's most common experience. And they don't really know how many die every year because they die from pneumonia. They die from fluid buildup. You know, that's the consequence. Fractured hip, fluid buildup, side effect of drugs, pneumonia, and they say they die from pneumonia. But I guess the official figure is 25,000 deaths a year. By the way, traffic deaths are down to 31,000 now, including pedestrians. So you have 8 million hospitalizations, probably cost $80 billion or $100 billion a year. You have ageless falls. Little kids break their bones. Elderly people break their hips or elbows or necks or whatever. And so why isn't there any excitement in this area over the decades? Because you fell. That's part of life. C'est la vie. Que sera, sera. Right? You fell. It was your own fault. You weren't looking. You were chatting away. You were looking at your iPhone. It's your own fault. And if you're old, you shouldn't have gone down the stairs. You should have held on to the railing or had someone else that you could lean on. Okay, there's a lot in that. You should have done Tai Chi. Tai Chi would probably prevent a lot of falls. You got to do it every day. Let us concede all that. The next culpability is the restaurant had a wet spot. They didn't have a warning. So it was the premises were at fault. And, you know, that's a big deal. I mean, my father ran a restaurant, and believe you me, that was one of the most frightening things, that someone would spill some coffee and someone would come along and sail into the air. As you know, there are a lot of lawsuits, slip and fall lawsuits. And overwhelmingly, they're not fraudulent fakes. But the insurance companies and the media like to paint it like it's just the way it's a racket by people. Oh, you trip and fall. We'll collect some money. By the way, whenever you hear the word frivolous lawsuits, crank this in. How long will a lawyer have any credibility with the local judges if they file too many frivolous lawsuits? And the judges can see right through these lawsuits. So there aren't that many frivolous lawsuits if they want to continue practicing in front of the judiciary. And they get thrown out, or they get sanctioned. And it's all open, and the press is there. It's not like backroom legislating or executive branch secret deals with business or meetings. It's all in the open. So let's say there are premises, ad hoc negligence, and let's say people do get a little too careless. But let's take a look at the landlord here. Do you know how badly enforced building codes are for tenants, especially poor tenants? Let me just read you out of it. Now, our cities are full of apartments that are rented in the following conditions: buckled or frayed carpeting, loose or buckled kitchen throw rugs, exposed electrical cords, loose or missing stairway handrails, loose, worn, or missing stair edges, slippery or excessively worn floors, cracked or elevated floor tiles, broken, cracked, or icy sidewalks. That's worse than ever, by the way. In the 1930s, communities were more concerned about repairing sidewalks than they are today. There was more of a pride, plus the fact they were used more. Clutter and debris, well, let's say that's the tenant. Slippery bathtubs. I mean, the number of people who go to the hospital out of showers and bathtubs, it must be a massive percentage. And the NICE figures can give you the data of injuries that in terms of hospitalization. So we're dealing with landlords that, first of all, they're pretty careless when they construct the building to begin with in terms of slip resistance. And when the tenants move in and the buildings are 20, 30, 40 years, they don't even get rid of the lead in the paint that's peeling off the tenement walls and poisoning the kids for decades, still to this day. So there's a liability factor there that needs to be done. Now, building codes are not enforced, fire codes are not adequately enforced. In the poorer areas, there's a lot of corruption involved, a lot of payoffs involved, inspectors are overburdened, you name it. It's not a coincidence that there's a correlation between poverty-stricken areas and the incident of fires. So the building codes need to be enforced. There's got to be more small claims courts because, if you fall and fracture your ankle and you don't have any lost wages because you're 14 years old or you're 80 years old, there's not going to be a lawyer that's going to take that case. It's not worth it, especially if the defendant's judgment proved. But if people learn to use small claims courts, which are everywhere, you don't need a lawyer. The fee is very small to register. Look at Judge Judy, right? It's the most popular television program. The ratings exceeded Oprah in the last 2 years of Oprah's show. People love to watch small claims, but they don't use the small claims courts. The bill collectors use them. The companies use them, but they don't. The people who are injured are not using them, and they have a limit, maybe $5,000, maybe $10,000. But you don't need a lawyer. You go with whatever you have in terms of evidence and pictures and so forth, and that's a deterrent. First of all, the big landlords of the housing projects, they don't want to send a lawyer there. It's not worth their trouble. So they often get a default judgment for anybody who does use small claims courts that way. If you ever have an airline complaint, think of small claims court. So the the similarities are almost eerie. You blame the person and ignore the physical environment, the maintenance environment if it's a tenancy. You make sure there isn't much research done in terms of floor covers or floor applications. You make sure that the universities don't do much work on the subject, although Emory is an exception to that, I'm told, right? Yeah. In the meantime, you had huge trauma, huge deaths, injuries, disabilities, pain, anguish, constant fear because you're going down rickety stairs and all that. That's not a very good quality of life. And a lot of sources of trauma are segregated. You only fear them when you're near them. But when it comes to slipping and falling, you're always near them. So how are you going to turn it around? Well, you turn it around first with books like this. Gripping drama. You got to have drama. Tragedy's drama. Let's face it. I had two relatives who fell in exactly the same place on a 3-staircase going up to the front door because the gradation was a lousy brick job. And the gradation was perilous and there was some ice. Just like that. So what we have to focus on is a kind of revolution that we saw when we first started opening access to people with disabilities. I never went to school with a disabled fellow student because they couldn't climb the stairs. And the schools were not about to lift them up the stairs. So they stayed home. How was that? Look at the great progress. Americans with Disability Act was preceded with sit-ins by disabled people in the Secretary's office, Joe Califano, Secretary of Health and Human Services. They would, block traffic. Then they got the laws. I now see people in wheelchairs having fun going down Connecticut Avenue, racing each other on the sidewalks. So who would have ever dreamed that, right? The blasphemy of today is a commonplace of tomorrow. I know when I was 20, 25 years old, anybody ever told me that they were going to redesign America so that people would go through the curb cuts all over the country? I said, what? No one's going to spend money like that. Yeah, they did. Access ramps to buildings? Yeah, they did. Why not? It helped people through no fault of their own who were, because of trauma or disease, they were frozen out of life. Now look at, they have the Special Olympics. They do incredible things that inspire people who are not disabled. They shame some people who are not disabled with their grit. So you see, that was dead in the water 50 years ago. Out of sight, out of mind, you're crippled. Use the word cripple. And it's tremendously turned around. So this idea of renovating for slip resistance, designing for slip resistance, maintaining for slip resistance has got to become a cardinal pillar of the culture of safety in our country. Even though it's not particularly anthropomorphic, a floor covering company, not exactly sexy, right? Home Depot, they're making money with the regular stagnant stuff. And why should they change it? Why should they change it? It's manufacturer, designers, retailers, standards groups. Now you're the Secretariat for ANSI, your group. That's a big breakthrough. So anything that ANSI comes up with, they're going to rely very heavily on your professional expertise. The problem is this whole slip and fall world is living in a non-mandatory society. It's all recommendations, OSHA, recommendations, Consumer Product Safety Commission, we'll see you later. Somebody here from Consumer Product Safety Commission? Anybody? No. I just met Bob Adler. He's very good. He's one of the commissioners. Another, I'm told, is a nurse, very interested in this, so maybe something would happen. The Product Safety Commission has been starved. It's had a weak statutory base. It had to start with voluntary consensus standards, had a recall that wasn't exercised very much. It's now much better than it was. Better budget, better commissioners, and stronger authority because they had legislation a while back to strengthen it. So you need to file petitions. That's what gets the regulatory process through. It's not very hard to file petitions, or you request a proposal. It's all administrative law. There's nothing particularly difficult about it if you have the facts. Now, there's an old Roman adage, out of the facts come the law. If you have the facts, and you know how to advocate, and you know how to spread the word, and you know how to embarrass and expose, you're going to get the law because you have public opinion on your side once they're informed. And as Abraham Lincoln said, with public sentiment, you can do anything. And without public sentiment, or what we say public understanding, there's not much you can do. Now, one of my friends was a chief scientist for NHTSA. Before that, he worked for Martin Marietta and other groups. His name was Dr. Carl Clark. And before he passed away, the one invention he was perfecting, don't laugh, airbags for humans. Airbags for elderly people. So when they walked around and they were heading for a bad fall, the airbags would go off and they'd be protected. Now you would think something that could save millions of fractures and sprains and injuries and pneumonias would be big news, right? We don't live in that kind of culture. He couldn't even get on TV with it. It's a very practical thing. It isn't like it's inflated all the time, by the way. But it works. You know, you fall, your hip doesn't break or fracture. Now, just a few days ago, Diane Sawyer interviewed an Olympic gold athlete whose name is Bruce Jenner. 16.5 million people watched that program to see if Bruce was going to call himself now a woman, transgender. Now, you think those 16.5 million people were worried about discrimination against transgender? Or do you think the bulk of them were engaging in a voyeuristic exercise? Now, I tell you, give me one life-saving invention and an inventor that can reduce injury, trauma, sickness, put that person on TV. You think there'd be 16.5 million people watching? We live in a culture of perverse incentives. The trivial, the sensational, the raucous, the pornographic gets plenty. Look at TV. Our property, by the way, our public airways. So let me give you an illustration. Have you ever watched Saturday afternoon network TV recently? Anybody here? 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Here's what you see. Here's how our property is used. Auto racing, bicycle flipping, you know, these kids that are airborne, you know, competing against one another, movie reruns, and infomercials. Now let's say your group says, you know, I want to buy time on Saturday afternoon for NBC or CBS or ABC. I know that the ratings are not what they used to be because a lot of the sports live are on cable. You don't see much baseball anymore. You see a lot of golf. Anybody who says that entertainment requires an audience, please explain golf to me. The dullest game is ever created, and golf supersedes baseball on network TV. Yeah. The tension, woo! A ball near a hole. You know? So let's say you want to put on a terrific 1-hour infomercial. And you alert all your people all over the country who are or should be interested in this slip and fall. Doctors, nurses, standards people, insurance companies, manufacturers, retailers, people who have fallen, wonder why they got hurt so badly, tenants. And you call up the network and you say, I'm willing to pay. How much is it? Try it. Try it. Any kind of kitchen slicer will get an information. Who has never seen, right, 6 knives for $7? Right? Anything that doesn't upset the power structure. Anything that doesn't upset the titillation factor. You know, slips and falls, not exactly funny, right? It's all Roman circus. It's sugar. It's don't upset the status quo. It's distraction. So what do I say to you? You call them up. I don't think it's that expensive, actually. However, it's network TV. It's available to everybody who has a TV set. 140 million households. In that sense, it's worth trying. If you get pushback, we will be very interested in looking at that case in the FCC. They don't sell it to you. And in that hour, you can do everything. You know, you can show real-life situations. You can have pictures of floorings and all the rest of it. All kinds of things. Hours, unbelievable amount of time to convey this kind of impression. I just want to end on this design factor. As you know, there are all kinds of materials for flooring design, flooring applications, sealants, everything. It's bewildering. And there's kind of a vested interest in each one by the vendors and their sales agents. But it strikes me that there is now the kind of floor covering that is almost magic in its ability to adjust to both human frailty and the conditions upon itself. And that's why you got to put that forward. You got to put the best technology forward in order to set the stage for proper labeling. Because even if you had a mandatory standard, that's not enough. You want a mandatory standard that gives stage 1, 2, 3, 4 in order to provide a commercial marketing incentive for manufacturers to want to aim for the best or not want to be seen as fourth class. And this is what the Product Safety Commission could do much more quickly than getting around to set a standard. You know, the companies that are opposed to standard proposals by regulatory agencies, they can delay it 15 to 30 years. The pedestrian protection standard for outside motor vehicles has been under consideration since 1968. It has never been issued. You know, it makes a difference whether you're hit at 10 miles an hour by a car with sharp edges around the headlights and hood ornaments and so on, and one where it's like a bubble. 30-some 5 years, they've been able to slow it down. The corporate lawyers are born again procrastinators. They can weave and dodge and obstruct and delay and harass from Capitol Hill and so on. So what you need to do with the Product Safety Commission is start with a rating system, which if you can get it under ANSI or you have it under ANSI is a step forward. But always do the best practices and always go after the biggest manufacturer that you think is culpable. People say, why did you go after General Motors? I said, because they're there. It's why do you climb Mount Everest? If you beat the big guy, the others will fall into line. And it was pretty tough to get on TV, just the way it is for yours. It's pretty tough to get on radio. However, the one thing you got going for you is everybody understands slip and fall. Everybody has had an experience. Everybody knows that certain floorings and conditions shouldn't have been the way they are. And everybody knows what the cost and family anguish turns out to be. So in summary, maybe we could help you with the petition. We could help you with the Product Safety Commission and develop a pushback from the networks. If they won't sell you an infomercial, we would take great interest in that. Thank you very much. Now we can have a discussion. Or you want to make points, ask questions, whatever you wish.
One of the things that you said.
Ria.
Yeah, you better.
One of the things you commented on was that that they initiated making the standards week to cater to industry. We're experiencing that right now. How did you get around that, or have you gotten around that?
Well, the first standards that the Auto Safety Agency put out were heavily SAE standards because they had to put them out fast under a deadline, and they didn't have the capability. Later on, they began to be more independent. But later on, the auto companies expanded the number of standards in their standards groups to try to say, take this standard. It's a never-ending fight. That's why every regulatory agency has to have its own R&D capability to set its own standard. The interesting thing, though, when the auto companies were fighting airbags, they didn't want to have an SAE standard because they just want to kill the proposal. They lost. They delayed it 10 years. A lot of people killed. Could have been saved. But they lost. They tried to play a vacuum game. Oh, there's no standard here. So the government put out a request for proposals, a request for comment, and their own staff engineers, developed the standards. They were helped by NASA research, by the way. Spin-off from NASA research. No, it's a never-ending fight. Try to get engineering professors teaching about standards groups to their students. It's like pulling teeth. We're about to put out an engineering reader. So they say, okay, your texts don't do it. Here's a reader. Because these students are going to be employees, and they're going to have to make some pretty excruciating decisions as to whether to blow the whistle or go along. And the ethics of the Society of Professional Engineers, they basically say to professional engineers that if you discover a defect in your place of work that could threaten the safety or health of people when that product is marketed, and you go up the ladder and point it out, and they tell you to shut up, you are professionally obligated to go to the authorities, to go to the regulatory agencies of the police. It's right in their code of ethics. But the students are clueless. They don't study these things, engineering students. Somebody else, please? Yes, ma'am. Two.
Hi, and thank you.
Louder, please.
I'm I'm wondering about kind of how to kind of get an in terms of, I'm thinking about bike safety.
Wait, I just got off the plane, you know.
Oh yeah, I'm thinking about
My ears are clogged. What?
so bike safety in a place like Atlanta, bicycling. There's not as much demand as there could be because it's so dangerous. And this is something that kind of the local civil engineers keep pointing to. Well, look, people don't ride that route, therefore we don't need to develop it safely for cyclists.
What's the hazard?
Cars.
Oh, cars.
Well, drivers.
Drivers.
Yeah. So just kind of how to get an in when there's not a direct demand at present because this form of transportation is so dangerous, but there really ought to be a demand. How do you kind of lobby civil engineers?
It depends. What's the demand for?
Safer cycling routes to be able to get around the city.
Oh, you're talking about bicycles.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is a problem all over the country now as more people doing bicycles. In Washington, they've literally, on some major routes, bicycles only on the highway. So you got the bicycle lane where the cars used to be parked, and then the cars are parked here, and then the cars are flowing here. And nobody thought that would ever be done because the car drivers never stand for it. It's done. And then they have these bike racks now, you know, rent a bike and all. So that's one way to do it. It's very treacherous for people to try to ride bikes in traffic. Very treacherous. Even, you know, when the door opens and they slam into the door of a car. So separation is what's, you know, what I see is the coming thing. And I take it you don't do that here in Atlanta?
We're working on it.
You have no separation yet? How about bicycle paths?
Getting better.
That are sort of parallel to commuters?
It's getting better, but we're not there.
You're not there yet. Well, you know, as we Northerns say, what do you expect? You're below Mason-Dixon. No, excuse me. No, it's the bicycle lobby is becoming more powerful, more demanding. They're taking best practices from one city and saying, what about our city? And, you know, all the power to them. You know, it's good exercise, but they shouldn't risk their lives to do the right thing that they think is the right thing. Bicycle paths, segregated parts of the roadway, and I'm amazed by the tolerance of motorists for it, though, even when you don't see that many bicyclists, except in rush hour. Isn't that amazing, Matt? Yeah. It's amazing. I thought there'd be it came from a mayor who pushed it, and then he was defeated, not for that, but I thought there'd be, you know, they'd roll it back, and they didn't roll it back. Yes, you want to? Could you speak a little louder, please?
Is this good? Okay. Hi. My question concerns special interests in the industry proposing for regulation. So, for instance, with Airbnb, which is a company that allows people who own apartments and rooms and houses to lease out their rooms temporarily for a night or so to compete with hotels, or, for instance, taxi lobbies, which are pushing for stronger regulations on how people can carry passengers in order to rule out Uber and new competitors. So my question is there a way to avoid companies and industries lobbying for stricter regulations in order to keep their comfortable market power and rule out future innovators and future firms?
Okay, first of all, I do not use Uber or Lyft and never will. Let me tell you why. They have horrendous databases on you, and they're going to use it. And that's an invasion of privacy. It's intolerable. Number two, I don't like part-time jobs replacing full-time jobs for their families. Number three, until they're getting more regulated, they didn't have adequate insurance. They didn't have the kind of safeguards as the taxi cab companies have to adhere to. Even knowing how to get around town without GPS. Now they're going to be more regulated. And now the cab companies, which were a bit too comfortable and were not responsive enough, especially when you tried to call them on the phone, now they're scared because of Uber, and they're picking up the phone after 4 rings instead of 30, in Washington at least. But now they're developing their own apps, so they're going to be able to compete with Uber. And so you will have like this pretty soon. And if Uber has too many drivers, they're not going to make enough money. And now some cab drivers go to Uber. Some Uber will go to, I see a sort of convergence as they both have the same apps and they both can do the same thing. But you know, when you talk in Washington, an average cab driver trying to support his family makes about $30,000 a year. And that's really hard work. The traffic, the pollution. And then all of a sudden, the income's cut in half because Uber has X number of people making a few extra bucks. I don't like that. But it's not going to last very long because it's all going to start converging. And the cab industry will be more responsive. Like in Detroit, the worst cabs you'll ever see. This is the motor capital of the world. I went to Detroit about 15 years ago, and I literally took a lot of cabs to make my point. There'd be holes in the floor. You could just tap the roof, right on the asphalt. Broken seat belts, part of the broken city of the motor vehicle capital of the world. So it's healthy for everyone. I see it shaking out.
Mr. Nader, I teach products liability across the street at Emory Law School, and I want to thank you for the ideas that you have given us. They certainly form the foundation of my products liability course, but I want to raise a question that's not directly related to that and ask you, because I'm concerned that we lose 25 to 36,000 people to gun violence, if there's any way to respond to the NRA and get better gun control.
Well, first of all, as you know, they are single-minded lobbying, very influential at the state and federal legislative level. The Brady Group tried to counteract them after after Reagan was wounded and Brady was wounded, he started with his wife, for those of you who don't know, a gun control group, and there are a few others. Bloomberg's putting a lot of money into this. The problem with the gun lobby is 80% of the NRA members want background checks. They would like safety on guns so 6-year-olds don't blow their little sibling apart. The NRA leadership and the more extreme one that just set up a few years ago have got this mentality that if they give an inch when they should be giving a foot, they're going to give a mile. So they're totally uncompromising. Now, there have been some lawsuits against gun manufacturers, like product liability. There have been some lawsuits against shipping weapons through dealer shows and where the buyers are not screened for criminal background. Some have been settled, but the product liability part has pretty much failed so far. They failed in the tobacco industry for years until they broke through. I think we are so different from Western Europe and Canada. In Canada, they have to get a license, they have to prove proficiency. In Western Europe, they often have to put their weapon in a special locked place in home, keep it away from the kids. We're like the Wild West. It's a rambunctious culture where after things like Newtown, you get even more wild proposals like, oh, Newtown occurred and all these kids were killed. What's the solution? Let everyone take guns to school. Let the teachers take guns to school. So it's going to take a real public education campaign. There'll be other mass killings and strategies. And it's got to have a strong lobby that Bloomberg can fund right on Capitol Hill. In other words, the genius of the NRA is if they don't spend time with big marches down Park Avenue or Connecticut Avenue in Washington, they do pinpoint in personam lobbying on their senator and representative. They know who their friends are, who they go hunting with, who gives them money, what their weaknesses are. They know tremendous database for each one of the 535 members of Congress. And that's what the sane gun control people have got to do. They've got to be adequately budgeted, and Bloomberg's the guy. He's really taken them on. And he can fund it. He gives $50 million grants. And he is funding it, actually. He is building a stronger lobby. I mean, there are some changes that are unquestionable. Background checks, safety locks, metal piercing bullets. The police should be stronger, a stronger support for reform in this area. Some of them are, but they belong to the NRA too. But I just think the preponderance of lobbying hours and money has been overwhelmingly on one side. And when you shift the balance, things are going to start happening. Yeah. Somebody else, please.
So, thank you, Mr. Nader. I'm Howard Harris. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, so I, myself and my colleagues, literally get to pick up or put back together the pieces of the the fall injury dilemma that this country's in. So I appreciate your colleague that strapped himself to a chair to demonstrate the inertia doesn't rip your organs out, but I'm not going to fall and break my hip to demonstrate that. But I'm curious.
He was actually your colleague. He was an MD.
Well, braver than I. But my question for you is, with the reactive position we're in as a medical community, we just take care of the problem after it's occurred. I can't practice preventative medicine to prevent these injuries with my medical degree. How can the medical community help get behind fixing this problem where we prevent those patients from showing up into our emergency rooms and adding to the current medical crisis we're in this country now?
Okay, 3 doctors actually helped me on auto safety, and the way they did it was they wrote medical journal articles, and they said, we can't repair a crushed skull, that you had to have prevention. Therefore, you had to have seat belts, padded dash panels. And there were 3 doctors who really were very outspoken, and I used their material every day. Dr. Campbell, Horace Campbell in Denver, Colorado. There was a doctor from San Diego, and one from Charlottesville, Virginia. So they faced the same problem, right? They were repairing and grieving professionally, and they said, we need engineering fixes. The airbag is a technological vaccine. So that's one thing that can be done. Medical journals are very receptive to trauma prevention articles by doctors. The second thing that can be done is your professional society can issue specific recommendations for prevention at their annual meeting and have workshops. Because the highest obligation of a doctor is prevention, right? And so that you can lend your credibility, who's going to fault you? Who's going to tell you you don't know what you're talking about? When an elderly person comes with a broken hip, I mean, you can give them chapter and verse. That's the second thing can be done. Because I used to meet neurosurgeons who would say, we can't keep up with all the crushed heads from motorcycle crashes by motorcycle riders who don't wear helmets. Well, I said to him, you know, you could start a national group, tithe yourself a little bit, get a couple dozen advocates, lawyers, organizers, publicists, and push for motorcycle helmet laws. Half the states or more now don't have motorcycle mandatory helmet laws. And the difference statistically is enormous between the states that do, states that don't. You know how many motorcycle riders were killed last year? It's the fastest growing traffic safety statistic, 5,500. Because the motorcycle makers are now appealing to 55-year-olds who want to be 20-year-olds. And the fact that they can bring the motorcycles in and surround a legislature and basically drum the bill out of existence, and they're scared. The lawmakers really get scared. They need backbone. They need neurosurgeons, orthopedic surgeons, neurologists, and so forth. It beats me why these specialties don't use a fraction of their credibility, because they speak from authority and humanity. Deadly combination for the bad guys. Authority and humanity. And so that's additional thing you could do. The third, you offer yourself up as an expert witness. So if you see a valid connection between a physical environment and the trauma that you're called upon to repair, you can be an expert witness in court. I know doctors don't like lawyers largely, and they don't like to be sued, but it really helps to have an expert witness. I know in the neurosurgery area, because a lot of the helmets are not really good, they're not protective, they don't work very well, and some are negligently designed. You almost have to have a neurosurgeon. You can have a percussion specialist and so on, but the neurosurgeon is what really conveys the ultimate penalty that results from inadequate helmets, concussions and all. So those are the things that I would suggest. Your annual society meeting, have a workshop, you put out a resolution, maybe even have a press conference, and invite some legislators, which you do for other reasons, and journal articles. Very important. I can tell you, as a young law student, I was enthralled by those three doctors and the way they phrased it, and you can read them for yourself. Out of the fact comes the law. It's Harvard Law School.
You've accomplished a whole lot in your years in the public sphere as a public advocate and servant, and spoken today very passionately and persuasively about a number of issues, from cars to helmets to floors. I'd like to know this: where do you see yourself going forward? What do you see yourself talking about, and how acting in the public sphere going forward from today? Not only what issues do you care about, because obviously you care about a lot, but how do you personally see yourself interacting with them?
Well, I always believe in starting new groups. That groups proliferate all over the country like trees in a forest. So we've got to have, like there's no group at all on the safety of nanotechnology. There are only 3 tiny groups on genetic engineering, right? They're not all plus, they have risks. In the auto safety area, very few groups, maybe 30, 40 people full-time. This is public advocacy for standards, recalls, etc. And when I say 30, 40 people, I'm taking part-times and melding them into full-time people. 5 part-time people, 1 person. So I think we've got to start new groups, because the groups that exist have been spectacularly successful. Center for Auto Safety has been responsible for the recall of millions of cars. They never had more than 4 people. A lawyer engineer runs it, and he has 3 other people. You would think that groups that are spectacularly successful would breed a public attitude that says, we want more of them. And lawyers should step up and fund them. Doctors should step up. Then it's no big deal. It's not millions and millions of dollars. None of these groups have budgets more than a couple million, $3 million. So I think we got to start more groups. Bring more engineers, scientists, doctors. Dr. Sidney Wolf of our health research group, you can't begin to count the drugs he's gotten recalled. Have you heard of him, by the way? He used to be on TV all the time until the crazies took over. Like afternoon television. He'd be on Phil Donahue. I'll give you an example. He and 2 other people put out 2 books in the early 80s, one called Pills That Don't Work, and the other called Over-the-Counter Pills That Don't Work. There were 750 medicines that were proven in medical journal studies not to be effective for the purposes for which they were advertised. So therefore, it was all negative. Any pill you take has no effect. You always pay some price, and you pay money. Billions of dollars a year. In 20 years, almost every one of them were removed at different stages. They violated the law. Drugs have to be safe and effective. They were not effective. Junk science. Biggest drug companies in the world. Junk science. All these scientists were towing the line, shutting their mouth for Merck and Pfizer and Lilly. And one doctor, going to work with his conscience, used to work at NIH, brought him to heel. So why don't we have more of them? So we've got to get more groups. Green Law, which I helped start here in Georgia. Look at, they have less than 10 people. They've enforced water pollution control permits. They've protected people, poor people who are in high toxic areas. They've dealt with children's asthma. 6% of all kids here in Georgia, over 100,000, have serious asthma. I mean, one thing after another. They have a budget less than $1 million. Why are they successful? 2 reasons. 1, they have evidence on their side. And 2, they're silently supported by a majority of people. Public sentiment. And 3, they have savvy. They have sense of strategy. So that's 1. More groups, more citizen advocacy groups to make government work, to make corporate sector behave, to install best practices, and to get more people in industry to bring their conscience to work. The other thing I'd like to do is make it easier for people to band together. So if insurance policyholders need a voice, they get an insert in their insurance bill twice a year, inviting them to join the nonprofit group, so they can have accountants, actuaries, economists take on Aetna or the big insurance industry. That could be done all over the economy. Insert in the billing envelope or online. It could also be done for your 1040 tax return. So, it's all about building democracy. There's plenty of people who would like to do the work, and there's not enough opportunities. The law students come in, they're idealistic. By the time their 3rd year comes along, they're full of debt, and they forget about it. And they go for the big corporate law firms. That's well known. Because there's not enough opportunities out there. I mean, I organized my law school class to start an Appleseed Foundation. They've got 17 centers for law and justice all over the country. They're creating opportunities for young lawyers. 1 law school class. We had a ball. I mean, they used to go to reunions. And all they talk about were their cases, how much money they're making. I got sick of it. And I said, look, are we serious or aren't we? On my 35th reunion, we got together, we started this foundation. They started these groups in Illinois and District of Columbia and Texas and so on. They're doing a lot of good work. You know how many law school classes there are in this country? Just think. How about medical school classes? 30, 35 years out. What if Emory Medical School class of 1980 has a reunion and decides they're going to do more than have a good time, drink it up, talk about old times, wallow in nostalgia. We just said we're going to start a group to advocate better nutrition in school vending machines and cafeterias, or any number of things dealing with prevention, childhood obesity. It's so easy. It's so easy to change things. You got to say it again and again. American history has been changed by a tiny fraction of 1% in almost every area, including civil rights, because they had the majority of the people behind them. That's what you see all the time. How many people got Social Security? How many people got women's right to vote? How many people got the farmers progressive? Tiny fraction of people. That's what it takes. And some of these fractions can be spearheaded by a courageous lawyer. There's now, we have dozens of courageous lawyers around the country. They take unpopular cases. They take impossible cases. And they don't win all the time. If they do win, they plow the territory for everybody else to follow. We started smoking on airlines. I don't know how many of you remember that. I once got on an airline, the guy next to me lit a cigar. You know what happens in your kitchen when you burn one slice of toast? The guy lit a cigar, and I said, I beg your pardon. My constitutional right. He goes like that. So I said, I'll fix these bastards. And so we formed the effort, interstate buses, interstate trains, interstate planes, half non-smoking, half smoking. That's all you could get in those days. It's like the smoke obeyed the barrier. But it was still better than nothing. In 1982, I think, we got the whole thing. And I'll never forget, you cannot believe the static we got, the smears, how dare you? It's like the smokers had a right to fill their smoke in your lungs, including the kids. I went to Princeton. They used to smoke in the classroom. You could hardly see your students. Huge smoke, right? And the smokers would blow smoke in non-smokers' face like, come on, get with it. Here's a lucky strike. Light up, right? So anyway, quick story. It's the last day of smoking on American Airlines. All airlines. First in the world. I like being first in our country. That's the true measure of patriotism. Not we can blow up other countries faster than anybody else. So I'm the last one on the plane to Buffalo. It was Allegheny Airlines. And so, I'm weaving with my suitcase, and my seat is the last seat in the window, next to the toilet. And I get to about 3 seats before, and this guy in the middle seat spots me. And a gleam comes into his eye. And as I'm, trying to get to my seat, he says, You are going to stop me from smoking. I got you now. All the way to Buffalo, he's smoking in my face. I'm doing the air vent, trying to blow the smoke the other way. We land. Stewardess says, put out your cigarettes. I turn to him and I say, did you have fun? He says, worth every minute. I said, I'm glad you have fun. You're never going to do it again. Just think of the outrage. Think of the people exposed to secondhand smoke. People with lung problems, kids with asthma. This is what we tolerated. It was considered impossible to have non-smoking areas. Now, if you went on a plane and someone lit up a cigarette, see? I'll bet you if a 19-year-old went on a plane today, fixed on the iPhone, like this, and saw somebody smoking, they actually would stop looking at the iPhone. So that's what we got to do. We all have a responsibility. We live in a country where we can make it happen. Better make it happen, because we're going to be cursed by our descendants. We got to be good ancestors. Got to get serious with the young. They're being distracted and entertained into ignorance and oblivion and powerlessness. It's serious addiction, this thing. I'd say to young people, do you know what you're doing to your iPhone, don't you? You say, yeah. One guy says, yeah, 100 text messages a day. I said, you know what the iPhone is doing to you? They don't have a clue. They think they're modern, the old folks, It's deadly. And it's going to be deadlier, when it becomes an implant. They'll have an implant pretty soon. There's no sense of limits to commercial impulses. No sense. If you ask Lockheed Martin, how many F-35s are enough? They won't give you a limit. Enough is never enough for profiteering corporations. How many Hostess Twinkies should you eat in a day? Well, be our guest, a couple dozen, we hope. Never enough. That's why every major religion in the world put boundaries around the mercantile impulse. Mammon. Every major religion said, do not give too much power to the profit impulse, because it knows no boundaries. It will destroy other values in the society. That's the tragedy of our professions when they become corporatized and they lose their independence, like cardiology practices now. They're down to 25% independent in the last 10 years because they can be bought up by hospitals, and hospitals can charge more. That's why we have to have two-track professions. You do with your clients, you get your fees, or your patients, and you've got to pursue a professional track of prevention. That's the highest calling. That's what you're going to look back on with the greatest pleasure and gratification. And that's how you're going to look the next generation in the eye. Technology is running away, and it's because it's running away in the hands of corporations and government. Technology, you say, oh, technology will save us. It all depends who controls it. Look at the painkillers. 15,000 dead a year now from the opiates. Going like this. Well, painkiller, that's a good thing. Look what's happened to it. Promoted, overprescribed, some of it criminal stuff. And look what's happening. It's a huge epidemic now. You know what it comes down to? I'll tell you what it comes down to. I don't want to philosophize. It comes down to self-respect, your own self-respect. You don't have an estimate of your own significance to make for a better world, you don't have self-respect. That's what it comes down to. Because what is not a better world is pretty hated by most people. Most people don't like corruption, wars, preventable diseases, congested traffic, all the things that if they got together, they could have headed off a lot of these things. Can we get back to fluorine? It's not unrelated, right? I mean, you have a burning passion. You have a burning passion, say, like Russell has. There are a lot of people who know as much about fluorine as Russell. But what's the difference? It's the passion. Like there were 10 or 12 people in the NBA as skilled as Michael Jordan. What's the difference? He had a crazy determination mentally to win. The nth factor. That's what it is. When I wrote Unsafe Speed, I got letters from automotive engineers saying, we know all this. We could have written 20 times this. Why didn't you? Business as usual. I remembered my friends. So everything starts with emotional intelligence. The fire in the belly is what sparks it all. Einstein said it in another way. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And by that he meant is you get more knowledge if you have imagination. He wasn't saying one against the other. It really is amazing how little we talk to young people. It's like we're afraid of our own children. It's like they know the technology, they know how to do this and that, apps, and who are we? We're just, we're dealing with typewriters. I mean, I just do typewriters. I don't do computers at all. I just do Underwood typewriters. When the lights go out with lightning, I'm still working. So some of the young people think I'm old-fashioned. And I say, okay, how many pages have you put out in the last month with your Mac? See, this there's an old story about Isaac Newton. And he went to a gathering in, 18th century England? And someone came up to him and said, Mr. Newton, why are you so much more brilliant than other scientists? And he said, I'm not so much more brilliant than other scientists, but I probably can hold the problem in my mind and work on it longer than most of them. Concentration. Okay? Einstein said imagination is more curiosity. In fact, Einstein said once, I have no special gifts. I just have a passionate curiosity. Sorry, so you got curiosity, concentration, and then this British poet, Blake, said, I don't know if it's apocryphal, he was at a social gathering and someone came, Mr. Blake, with whom are you living with today? And he says, with whom am I living with? I'm living with my imagination. So you got imagination, curiosity, concentration. Fast forward, what is our young generation reflective of? Short attention span, low estimate of their own civic significance to change anything. They don't even know where City Hall is. They've never been to a town council meeting. And their imagination is great with video games. Can't fault them on that. And hundreds of thousands of trivial apps. Are they imagining new ways to prevent conflict in the world? Are they imagining new ways to overcome Madison Avenue exploitive advertising for kids, bypassing parental authority? What are we creating here? Why don't we have a discussion? All our politicians never want to talk about this. They're dialing for the same corporate dollars. When I ran for president, I would have a list of my issues, changing directions, reforms, that were almost entirely supported by a majority of the people. And they were also completely off the table for discussion by the Republican and Democratic candidates. Completely off the table. They wouldn't talk about raising the minimum wage, cracking down on corporate crime, the Pentagon bloated budget, full Medicare for all. You want to discuss it. If you don't discuss it, and the two parties dominate everything, the media and the debates, nothing moves, right? You don't discuss anything. Nothing moves. Nothing changes. We got all these solutions on the shelf in our country and all the problems on the ground, and we got a democracy gap and we're not taking them off the shelf. Like in the 1930s, the head of MIT, the head of Edison, and the head of MIT and the head of another big company said, our country should go the carbohydrate way of energy. Because anything you can make from hydrocarbons, coal, oil, gas, you can make from carbohydrates growing on the farms. And instead we went hydrocarbon. So you had, leading scientists, academics, nobody listened. No politician picked it up. So that we got to be much more demanding of our politicians. It's crazy to have people who are elected, they're beyond ignorance. Remember, I've never seen a worse Congress. They're beyond ignorance combined with arrogance, combined with selling themselves to the highest corporate bidders. And these are the 535 representing America. I would vote for about 15% of them. But the rest, the first thing Gingrich got, your gift to America. The first thing he did when he toppled the Democrats, he got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment. This was a $20 million adjunct of Congress that would evaluate technological matters before the Congress. Like, does this weapon system really work? Does this medical device work? And it worked beautifully. All the reports are online, by the way. OTA, it's on the Princeton website. And he killed it. And he said, we'll get our own scientists. This is his very words. We'll find our own scientists. And they had this independent group. I'm telling you, you cannot believe what it could have saved America. With the F-22, phony missile defense, which the American Physics Society says is unworkable, is costing us $10 billion a year, which is the EPA budget. The whole EPA budget, $10 billion a year. This is what represents us? I mean, I thought Jimmy Carter's phrase when he's running for president, I want a government that is good, decent, honest as the American people. A little bit, flamboyant, but it is true that the people collectively are ahead of the politicians. They would never, never behave with their families the way our public budget is chopped up. Never. They've never created enemies and give half of their budget to the police. We do. That's why juries work. That's why juries work. Juries is a spectacular institution. And the judges are polled, say, they really do a pretty good job. They have no axe to grind, no ambition once they finish. They're not doing it for the money, that's for sure. And they're deliberating. And that's what it is. I would trust a jury of 12 as to whether we'd go to war more than Congress and the president combined. Just a jury of 12, randomly selected. We've got real problems. But the war on terror is big business, isn't it? It's what Eisenhower warned about. Military-industrial complex. Can't repair our own public works. Things are falling apart. Schools, bridges, sewage systems, drinking water systems. But we can by the way, there's an engineering professor at Columbia. Before he died, he estimated all the weapons we have in TNT equivalent. He says we can blow up the world 300 times. One Trident submarine with multiple warheads can destroy the 200 biggest cities in the world in 1 hour. So now you know why the Soviet Union and the U.S. finally started getting arms control agreements. But we're way, way off our subject. But, I'll tell you, the thing is fire in the belly. Whether it comes from religious impulses, civic impulses, experience of tragedy in the family, just anger that applied knowledge is not being applied to save life. Doesn't matter what it is. That's what puts your mind to work. There's plenty of brilliant people in the world, otherwise preoccupied. And it's so easy to turn so many things around. There's some things that are very difficult to turn around, behaviorally. But you make a list of most of our secular problems, Europe doesn't have half of them. Even Europe now in trouble. Because they had social democratic parties, stronger unions, co-ops, and after World War II, they got a decent safety net. You know why there are less rebellions against taxes in Europe than here? It's because they get something for their taxes. They get health insurance, they get good public transit, they get free university education. What do we get? The 40th nuclear sub? That's why there's less kickback. Here, people sit around and say, what the hell are we getting? Can't even fill the pothole here on Elm Street. But, you know, we don't learn from other countries. I'll bet you there are, even in this area, there's better practices in some other countries. Why don't we learn from them more? We're very self-satisfied here. We grew up being told we're number one in everything. Yeah, we're number one in prison incarceration. We're now like 18th in wages. We're 19th in infant mortality. Shame on us. The first impulse to change is self-respect. That's what it starts. And then it's indignation. I'd be up before Congress. You're an angry young man. I say, yeah, and what else? Why shouldn't I be an angry young man? You're letting these auto companies build death traps. What's wrong with being an angry young man if you've got the facts? So this is what it's about. While we're talking, how many people have been injured in the U.S., slip and fall? You know, it's crazy. And you can do it you can intersect the continuum in every conceivable way. People having better balance in their older age, better repair of tenements, and all the way to the design of floors and stairs, and all the rest of it. You got to get onto it. As I say, the one thing we got going for you, you don't have to explain the slip and fall. So, you know, look, you ever see me on television saying this? On our own property? Can't get on, can't get 5 minutes. But go for that information, Russ. I can't wait for that to be, flush them out. I don't think they're going to rent it to you. Did you know after Ross Perot ran the second time in 1996, he was cut off. He couldn't buy time. Would you believe that? He could not buy his hour. Do you remember how in 1992 he'd have the charts and all? NBC and ABC, they wouldn't sell it to him. The FCC was in the pockets of the broadcast industry. So after it was over, I called him up and said, Ross, I've been aching to ask you a question. He said, what? He said, how's it feel to be a multi-billionaire? You can't even buy time for television. He said, you know, I never would have believed it. He was ready to put cash on the barrelhead. They wouldn't let him do it. It's our property. We're the landlords. They're the tenants. They decide who says what, who gets on 24 hours a day. How come we don't study that? You know, I never studied that even in law school. We own the richest wealth in the country. It's called the Commonwealth. It's not Wall Street. It's the Commonwealth. The pension plans and the mutual funds own the biggest slice of stock of Wall Street. The public lands are owned by the people. The public airways are owned by the people. All the R&D that built the semiconductor, pharmaceutical, containerization, biotech, it's all heavily taxpayer R&D. And yet, we grow up never saying, what are we getting for this? Why are they overcharging us? There are drug companies that are charging us staggering prices, and the drugs were developed by government R&D. Staggering. The latest example is the drug companies now are buying drugs from other drug companies they think are underpriced, and they're tripling the price. 3/4 of all cancer drugs rooted in NIH research. So how come we don't want to control more of what we own and get benefit from it? Because that's the way we're grown. That's the way we grow up in our education system. We grow up in a corporate society. So we don't even demand to control what we own. You know why I'm digressing here? I want to get you angry. Anybody want to comment or anything?
In the back.
Yeah. This light is really... whew.
Mr. Nader, I'm one of those iPhone generation people. I just wanted to ask.
You have to get close to the mic.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, and I know this is a little bit off topic, but as long as we're digressing, because it's on the minds.
Get close to the mic.
It's on the mind. It's on my mind. I think it's on the minds of people my age. If you have any comments about what is happening in Baltimore tonight and yesterday night, and even Ferguson, and if not, if you would rather not answer that question, I understand. I also would love to hear your thoughts on student loan debt.
Can't hear you. You got to get next to the mic.
Either your thoughts on Ferguson or Baltimore and sort of the racial police dynamic going on right now, or your thoughts on student loan debt.
Opinion on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. First of all, here's an example. For decades, we know that community policing works. Why don't we apply it? You have people who are police who are in the community, in the neighborhood. You know? It works. Suddenly, we get a situation where people come in from the suburbs. Yeah, you know the problems. So community policing, one. The second is the son of the owner of the Baltimore Oils. His name is John Angelos. He just put a blog like this. I wish I had it here. Oh, here it is. Now I'm going to read this to you in answer to your question. This is a guy who is a multimillionaire. His father owns the Orioles. He's a successful lawyer. This is right after Baltimore blew up. Only it's nothing compared to what could happen, like what happened in Newark and Detroit and LA in the 60s. Here's what he said. Here it is. He's responding to somebody who was a sports radio broadcaster and who said, these protests are negatively impacting the people of Baltimore. And he said, any really important message out of these protests is lost when the rest of the community is disrupted. End quote. Okay, so this really upsets Angelos. He's in his late 40s. And here's how he replies to Brett Hollander. Do you mind? This will take about 3 minutes. Okay. Brett, speaking only for myself, I agree with your point that the principle of peaceful, nonviolent protest and the observance of the rule of law is of utmost importance in any society. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mandela, and all great opposition leaders throughout history have always preached this precept, nonviolence. Further, it's critical that in any democracy, investigation must be completed and due process must be honored before any government or police members are judged responsible, like for shooting unarmed people. And he continues, that said, my greatest source of personal concern, outrage, and sympathy beyond this particular case of Freddie Gray is focused neither upon one night's property damage nor upon the acts, but is focused rather upon the past 4-decade period during which an American political elite have shipped middle-class and working-class jobs away from Baltimore and cities and towns around the U.S. to third-world dictatorships like China and others, plunged tens of millions of good, hard-working Americans into economic devastation, and then followed that action around the nation by diminishing every American's civil rights protections in order to control an unfairly impoverished population living under an ever-declining standard of living and suffering at the butt end of an ever more militarized and aggressive surveillance state. The innocent working families of all backgrounds whose lives and dreams have been cut short by excessive violence, surveillance, and other abuses of the Bill of Rights by government pay the true price and the ultimate price, and one that far exceeds the importance of any kids' games played tonight or any at Camden Yards. That's the ball field of the Orioles, where they canceled the game. We need to keep in mind people are suffering and dying around the U.S., and while we're thankful no one was injured at Camden Yards, there's a far bigger picture for poor Americans in Baltimore and everywhere who don't have jobs, are losing economic, civil, and legal rights, and this makes inconvenience at a ball game irrelevant in light of the needless suffering government is inflicting upon ordinary Americans. Freddie Gray's family says that his voice box was crushed and 80% of his spine was severed. If people want to focus on broken windows instead of this fact, Angela's epic Twitter moment should be classified as required reading. So they're enlightened rich people. They got to speak out. Does that answer it? Part of it? Look, people don't riot in middle class areas. They don't riot in upper income areas. They don't riot in places where there are public servants. You know, the police spend far more time patrolling well-to-do areas than they do the ghettos. And so it's the same with the fire prevention facilities. And the toxics are more where poor people live. So we got, got to talk back to the Rush Limbos. Loves wars, draft dodgers. Goes after drug addicts, and he's one himself. Makes $1 million every 10 days. Not bad. I accused him of being a corporate welfare king. He said, "What the hell is Nader talking about?" I said, "You're using our property free, the public airways, making tons of money." I don't think anybody ever said that to him. He thinks he's free enterprise, hates government, and he's a freeloader. I challenged him to a debate. He demurred. See, if we had a good communication system, this conference would be on cable. We have over 150 cable channels. Have you ever itemized what each one fills with? I heard that they were going to have a cable channel for chimps, prancing around in clothes. Chimpanzees. There's not a cable channel for workers, not a cable channel for consumers. There's not a cable channel for students. Upside down, it's crazy. The way to understand the society is to commit it and then analyze it. I was talking to a neurosurgeon, brilliant guy in California, and he said to me, if a person spends all their time hedonistically, like they eat sugar all the time, they engage in all kinds of hedonistic practice, they will eventually destroy themselves. Like they don't show up for work, they get drunk, and so on. Okay. He says, what happens when a society behaves excessively hedonistic? What happens when 90% of our public radio, TV, and cable is entertainment and ads? I'm old enough to remember that public radio and public broadcasting sold themselves that they were not going to have ads. Public radio is supported by every 5 minutes. I'm old enough to remember that cable TV was called pay TV, no ads. Look what's happened. But the worst thing is, they keep serious discussions off the air, life or death discussions off the air. And it's time for us to control what we own. I love to talk to conservatives. You think you should control what you own? Yeah, okay. How about the public airways? Any of you ever hear of Phyllis Schlafly? You know, she's hated by liberals because she's against what's called the Women's Lib movement. Well, I testified right next to her for public channel, the Audience Network. A certain amount of time every day would go back to the people, and they would be organized to program it, have their own reporters. And the broadcast industry was right there against it, and me and Phyllis Schlafly, right? Why? Because we both want voice. Whether you're conservative, liberal, whatever, you both want voice. And your particular cause here, if it had voice 50 years ago, there'd be a lot fewer people going to hospital. But you're kept off the air. You're kept off the mass media. That's what you got to fight against. So we even have a website called Debating Taboos. Washington's full of taboos, things nobody wants to discuss. Go to debatingtaboos.org. You'll see the first 4. They're on C-SPAN. Anyone else? Oh yeah, here. My fellow alumnus, right? She went to the same law school. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, you spoke about your colleagues and friends who were killed in car accidents, and I was just wondering, generally, what puts the fire in your belly?
Pardon?
What puts the fire in your belly?
Anger about preventable death. You know, why is that such a freakish thing?
It's not.
For most people, it's a freakish thing. Like when I was up before the Kennedy-Ribicoff committee, one of the senators said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Why am I doing this? Would you ask someone who worked for the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals that question? So why do you ask someone who's trying to work for the prevention of cruelty to humans that question?" The press liked that one.
I was wondering if there was any particular experience or anything like that that motivates you specifically.
Well, yes, not personal, but enough friends, who hasn't experienced? Friends, I dedicated my book to my classmate at Harvard, Fred Condon. Here's was his crime. He worked for an insurance company in New Hampshire. He had a wife and 4 kids, including twins. He was 28 years old. He was driving back home, a 20-mile commute from Concord. He was tired. And 10 miles from home, he drowsed. The car went off into the shoulder and rolled over. There were no seatbelts in the car those days. Rolled over, and he was totally bloodied. His wife rushed to the scene. First thing he said to his wife, he said, "Marcia, calm down. At least my mind is intact." And he lived until he was 72. And he told me the thing that kept him from killing himself, he was a paraplegic, was his kids. So I dedicated the book to him. That wouldn't have happened with seatbelt. He would have been restrained, and with a decent door latch, the door would not have popped open, throwing him half on concrete and half in the driver's seat, twisting his spine. I don't know how people can't get angry about that. It meets all the common law principles of crime. The auto companies had the solution. They knew about the danger. They had all the evidence year after year. They proceeded not put the solution in for reasons unrelated to saving lives. Criminal negligence. It's not that they weren't charging for it, right? They would charge for the seatbelt. They didn't want to give the car, the psychosexual dreamboat, any intimations that anything in it spells possible crash. The other thing that got me was when I was 6 years old, I go to these theme parks, I'd get in these little cars, and the whole idea was to smash into someone else, right? With a rubber bumper and a governor. So I said, if they can do it for the theme part, no, I guess the way you just grow up that way, you know. We were told by our parents, freedom means responsibility. Don't wave the flag unless you're waving it for justice. So we grew up that way. You grew up in a small town. The courthouse is right down the street. You go and watch the lawyers. You know, every little bit counts in that way. But I don't think it's difficult to acquire. Most people have a sense of injustice. They just don't relate it to what they can do about it. Do you know anybody that has never said that's not fair? Anybody who's never said that's wrong? I've never met anybody who's never said words like that. They just don't have, they don't see they have a role in this, because their whole education is wasted in that. It's all learn computer skills, not civic skills. Don't connect the school with the community. Learn, where does the drinking water come from? You know, how do they pave the roads? How do they collect the taxes? How do they run the elections? They all go to malls. So our generation has not been very good with them. And the parents know it, you know. The kids are running away with it. The technology is severing the generations in a big way. You got kids now so addicted on video games, it's beyond psychiatric. It's almost suicidal. They don't study, they don't eat, they don't socialize, they don't talk with their siblings. Total fanatic. Anybody seen that operate? Total fanaticism and competitive. Someone once said, you know why people aren't civically active? I said, why? Because it strains the brain physiologically. He says, what? He says, why do people don't exercise? Who don't exercise? Because it's a strain, right? It requires effort. It's the same thing with the brain. That the music, song, jokes, comedians, movies, it's not much of a strain. But when you got to do sequential thinking, and you got to figure yourself out, and you got to deal with risk, and you got to maneuver other people you may not like, and you got to do things that you'd rather spend time watching a movie or whatever, it's a physiological strain. Anything to that? I mean, chess playing is a physiological, isn't it? A chess player is tremendous strain. I mean, physical strain. I'd rather not believe this. But then all you need is 1%. Give me any main problem in the country, 1% representing majority opinion in congressional districts, for example, situation would be improved. I did a book, Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, in 2009. It was fiction, but it took 17 real-life mega millionaires, billionaires like Warren Buffett, Yoko Ono, Ted Turner, and I put them in fictional roles where they met in a hotel in Maui, and in 1 year said they were going to give all their pressure, all their Rolodex, all their smarts, and as much money as it needs to turn the country around top down, bottom up. And then I said to myself, prove it. And the book is about how they did it in 1 year, up against huge opposition. And at the end of the year, they had spent $15 billion. And they had created clean election parties and neighborhood groups, found all kinds of natural leaders all over the country, changed Congress, brought Wall Street to heel. People say, well, it's impossible. 1 year? Actually, you can make more fundamental changes that are long overdue quicker than taking a longer time. Look how long the healthcare insurance system is. You know, Canada did it in a year, and they have free choice of doctor and hospital. They do it on half the price per capita. And so I think a very small number of people, and they're not the same people. They're different 1% can pull it off. Look, once you deduct all the people who have problems, they're taking care of elderly grandparents, 2 jobs, can't support daycare, or they're ill, or disabled, or they don't know how to read. When you keep deduct, there aren't more than 40 million people left, who have the time, the experience, the moxie, but that's more than you need. All great movements start with tiny people. They often end with tiny people, but they make life better for a lot of people. Well, I guess in order not to trespass on eternity, I leave you with this. Contact us any way we can help, by all means. And in the 2, Product Safety Commission and the infomercial. And we're starting a museum of tort law, first law museum in America. And once it expands, we'll have more exhibition space to do more different kinds of torts. Tort is a wrongful injury. So it's long overdue. Some of our founders are from here in Atlanta. We have Jim Butler, got that $150 million verdict the other day. It's going to open up the whole defect model of that model. That Jeep Cherokee that fries people. And Tom Malone, David Boone. Some of them are founders around the country. Anyway, it's going to open late September. It's going to be a big opening day. You'll probably get good national media. And educate people about juries and trials and evidence and justice for wrongfully injured people and deterrence. Nobody likes being sued, but would you like to live in a country where nobody who wronged you could be sued? We have names for those countries overseas. Oh. Huh? Oh, it's my hometown. Yeah, since streaming is, you can stream anything. It's Winston, Connecticut. But there's more people in 2.5 hours around it than any place in the United States. It's Boston, New York, and so on. Plus the streaming capability. So.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Nader. If you can join me, another applause for Mr. Nader.
Thank you.
And I know most of you don't want the night to end, and the good news is Mr. Nader is going to be out front with doing a book signing, and so the conversation can continue.